Education is not the filling of a vessel, but the kindling of a flame. Ever since ancient times, the conversation around how we should educate the future and how we should educate our next generation has been ongoing. It's always been an argument, it's always been a discussion. There's been a lot of different ideas by a lot of different people in a lot of different societies on how we should educate the future and how we should educate our future generations. And a lot of these ideas conflict with one another, so we just end up having to fight over how we should educate our future generations. Whether it's banning certain books that we should think children should not be reading, or it's changing the entire curriculum in order to make sure that they're learning better, there is a lot of different change going on throughout the education system. But throughout history, every philosopher has had their own view and take on how we should educate future generations, and Schopenhauer was one of many. Schopenhauer was a German philosopher in the 1800s who wrote his most famous work in 1818 called The World as Will and Representation. After writing his main philosophical piece, he continued to write more pieces and essays based off of that, but most of his work was just essays and smaller fragments of his work that have to do with different topics about many different subjects. In his essay on education, Schopenhauer defines the goal of education as to provide people with the knowledge of the world and what is in the world. After defining this goal, he goes into the two methods of education that he believes most people are educated through. The first way in which people can be educated he calls natural education, which is basically making your own observations about the world, going and learning things firsthand, and making your conclusions and ideas based off that experience that you had. He believes that in this way people are able to create their own original ideas about what they learn and are not influenced by bias. The second way which he outlines that we can be educated is artificial education, which is basically anyone teaching you with books or lectures or videos or anything else that someone else is teaching you from their point of view. You haven't gone out and directly observed this thing, and someone else is just directly teaching it to you. So for example, in biology, when you're being taught about cells, you haven't gone out and looked at a microscope yet, you haven't looked at these things, someone is just showing you a diagram that they made about what these cells look like, what is their function, what they do. That would be artificial education. Natural education would be you taking a sample, going to a microscope, putting it under there, and looking at it and examining the cell yourself and making ideas based off the observations that you make. As we read deeper into Schopenhauer's philosophy on education, we learn that he's very much not in favor of artificial education. He doesn't have a problem with it, he thinks it has its place, but teaching kids based on just artificial education and secondhand education is not the best way, because it distorts and perverts the child's perspective about the world and allows them to interpret things wrongly. He believes that the child should have natural education first, where they can make their own observations and own ideas about the subject before someone else comes along and puts their ideas into the child's head. An example of harmful artificial education that Schopenhauer outlines in his philosophy is strict religious teaching. He believes that strict religious teaching can really distort a child's view of the world and how they interpret things about the world. He was very much against clergy teaching children about the world and the things in the world, because that teaching would have to come through a distorted, biased perspective of the clergy. So when children were taught about other religions, they were taught as, okay, these other religions are inherently nonsense, but ours is the true one. This would distort the child's perspective on other religions, as they would begin to just immediately dismiss other religions because that's what they were taught by the clergy. It's as if you asked a Muslim school teacher in a Muslim school full of Muslim students to teach about Christianity. They could do their best, they could honestly and earnestly teach about what Christians believe, what the beliefs and doctrines are, but at some point they would put their own take, their own perspective, their own distortion on the teaching. So at some point they would say, oh, we are Muslim though, and we don't believe these things, and this is the correct way. That would immediately distort the child's view of Christianity, because they've been taught through the perspective of someone who doesn't believe in Christianity. Same thing with Christians and Muslims. Christians might be teaching about Islam, they might teach it earnestly and honestly, but at some point they will put their own perspective and take on it, where they will say, yeah, this is another religion from another part of the world, but ours is the true one, and this is how we're going to look at this. So after the child is taught about the single perspective on a single issue, they will adopt that viewpoint, and now when they go throughout life, they will say, okay, Christianity is the one true religion, everything else I see here is a distortion or a wrongdoing or an error in human making, without having to actually gone in and ask the people that are those religions their perspective and how they would explain it. So in this way, I think Schopenhauer would be very much in favor of religious studies classes, because in that way they would have a unbiased teacher, as much as a teacher can be unbiased, teach about all religions equally without putting their own take on it, and the children could decide for themselves and see for themselves which religion makes the most sense to them. But throughout this whole philosophy, Schopenhauer doesn't dismiss artificial education. He knows that we need artificial education. It's necessary. There's no way to get rid of it. We have to artificially educate children on some things. But what should we do? Schopenhauer was very much in favor of developing a child's critical thinking skills. He believed that before any information is shoved into their heads, before any perspectives are given to them, they should be taught critical thinking skills and given problems which they can critically think through and learn how to use their critical thinking in order to make decisions. So Schopenhauer believed that children should be given the chance, if possible, to learn about things naturally throughout the world. So if they are being taught about religions, they should be given the chance to go out and ask people who believe in those religions about what they believe, how they do their practices, and what their perspective is. In this way, I think he would also be very much in favor of the labs that we do now in science classes, where we have the children do the experiments themselves, and the teachers ask them, what is your observation? What do you think happened here? And the child can say what they think that happened, and they can make their own observations about what they saw. One of the other things that Schopenhauer says about educating the next generation is that they should not be taught subjects which have a high potentiality of creating error for them, creating major serious error in their judgment. Schopenhauer says, no child under the age of 15 should receive instruction in subjects which may possibly be the vehicle of serious error, such as philosophy, religion, or any other branch of knowledge where it is necessary to take large views. He basically said that until you're 15, you should be taught things which you don't have a lot of chance of making errors in, which we can find the errors immediately as soon as you make them. He suggested that maybe you learn mathematics, languages, natural science, things which you can directly see that something is wrong when you make a mistake. And also that these mistakes don't have large, huge implications on your life if you make a mistake in them. So if you add 2 plus 2 and you say, oh, it equals 5, then yeah, that's wrong, but we can fix it easily and it's not a big issue. Or even with languages, you can talk about languages and say a word wrong and we can correct you and you go on your way, and there you go. No serious issue, nothing crazy happened. You didn't change your worldview because you got the language instruction wrong. Finally, Schopenhauer states that we should be fully utilizing a child's memory, or their powerful memory, their capability to remember things, in order to teach them natural languages, in order to teach them mathematics, natural sciences, and have them be able to understand things which will be useful to them later on in life. But this powerful memory of a child is also a double-edged sword, because if they are instructed incorrectly, if they are instructed wrongly, then this error can really persist in their mind over the years and create a biased and a flawed perspective for life. So after all this education, after all these suggestions, what is our goal? Schopenhauer states that our goal is achieved and we have acquired perfect knowledge when we can connect our abstract ideas with the experiences that we have in the world. So when you're taught about cells and you go and do a lab, you can connect the idea of those cells, you can connect the ideas that you were taught about the mitochondria, the chlorophyll, and their location in the cell with the observation, with the experience you had in the real world. That is what Schopenhauer believes makes perfect knowledge, true knowledge. Now, as all of Schopenhauer's essays do, they connect back to his main work, The World as Will and Representation. Now, how does this essay on education connect back to his work? He believes that by educating people right, by educating them correctly and having them have the better perspective on the world, they will be able to overcome the will, overcome this thing that causes so much suffering in the world. By educating individuals on how the will works and the illusions in the world which they operate by, we can educate them on how to live better. They can learn, they can make decisions about life that allow them to suffer less. And he even states that this kind of education can lead to us, after finding out that the world is suffering, is full of suffering. He had a very pessimistic philosophy about the world, that the world is just suffering. We can realize that we all share in this suffering, and through that we can become more empathetic and more moral to one another. So overall, education was very important to Schopenhauer because he wanted to educate people about the will in the world. He wanted to educate them on why they suffer, why there's so much suffering, and show them the true perspective of the world, which is complete suffering. Through this education, people will be able to live less sufferful lives. I don't even know if that's a word, but they can live lives that have less suffering in them. But that is pretty much Schopenhauer's perspective on education. He believes that natural education is much more important than artificial education, although he does acknowledge that artificial education is very important. After all, his book in philosophy is a book that is artificial education, so he must agree to artificial education to an extent in order to be making books. So yeah, he believes in artificial education, but he thinks natural education and being able to connect our general ideas about the world with the experiences that we have is a much better way of learning. I think Schopenhauer wouldn't be too mad about the education system right now. Maybe some things he would disagree with, but I think he would really agree with the science education that we're doing currently, where we have students learn about the general ideas in lectures and by artificial education, and then through natural education they go and observe those ideas which they're taught about, so they can connect those general ideas that they're taught with the observations that they make in the lab. But that's just my take on it. Let me know what you guys think about this philosophy. Do you think Schopenhauer is wrong in some way? I think there's some issues here. I think he doesn't give artificial education enough credit, but let me know about your guys' opinions in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video.